So yes, this is my presentation basically on what I've been working on and what I do and why it's important. So this
Mhm.
is one of one for you. So this is the symbol I use, and I can explain that a little bit more later. But it's a combination of the alpha and the omega.
Mm.
So let's start off with kind of where we're at the moment, which is there is a lot going on, as you very well know. We're having a lot of issues from the loneliness crisis to the climate crisis to exponential technology like social media and AI running rampant over the population and causing all sorts of strange things in the sense-making ecology. We're having difficulty um, with war still, as you very well know. We're having a lot of conflict at the moment in Ukraine, in the Middle East. Um, and we are basically in a world of some pretty acute crises, as well as a lot of basically existential risk level crises, like with climate and with what's going on with technology. And this has been termed the polycrisis because a lot of these issues are interacting with each other and reinforcing each other. So the loneliness epidemic is exacerbating political polarization, which is leading to conflict and inability to coordinate to do things about the climate crisis, et cetera. So this is kind of the landscape we find ourselves in, which is a interconnected series of crises. And
Mhm.
this polycrisis is actually just the symptom of an even bigger crisis, which has been termed the meta crisis, which is the inability to collectively coordinate to solve those interconnected problems. So the inability to take a systems level perspective or have organizations and coordination at a systems level that we could actually try and approach these things without causing more problems. Because often just trying to fix things in isolation is actually exacerbating other problems. And so we need to look at these things holistically. And our inability to do that as a planetary civilization is called the meta crisis, which is its own kind of tier of issues that we find ourselves in. And my argument is that the meta crisis is actually the result of a meaning crisis. So these are a whole lot of crises, but this is the final one, which is that we don't know as a people what actually is important. We don't have
Mhm.
a sense of what actually we want to do, what we want to optimize for as a species, as a society, um, as a planetary society. And this, I would say, is a new thing. For the majority of human history, this has been very well understood from when we were in tribes to when we were in small agricultural communities to even when we were in something as recent as the Second World War or the Industrial Revolution. The organizations that human beings were creating and were a part of politically and at a large scale had a very strong sense of what they thought was right and wrong. Um, and this essentially came from a very narrow perspective or taking very narrow perspectives, usually ethnocentric perspectives or patriarchal perspectives, and kind of shrinking the world down into the worldview understood by a specific group or subset of the culture or of the total set. And what's happened with the rise of postmodernism, which is basically only really widely adopted since the 60s or the 70s in the West, is we now have all perspectives are seen as valid. They're on the table now. So
Mhm.
in American culture or Western culture generally, there is, on the leading edge of it at least, there is an understanding of the innate feminine wisdom. There's an understanding of the validity of experiences of different socioeconomic class, and those being equally valid experiences with their own kind of cultural views that cannot be imposed on one another. There's an understanding that different cultures around the world and different religions hold their own truths and all have something valuable to say. And the discourse for the last, let's say, 50, 60, 70 years has been how do we get these different perspectives to the same table? How do we bring masculine and feminine into conversation? How do we, and try to rebalance them? How do we bring in Eastern wisdom and Western wisdom together spiritually and try to harmonize them? That would be, more in the spiritual movement. How do we reclaim an understanding of indigenous wisdom as we think about the environment and as we think about climate and as we think about ecology? How do we try and remember and reintegrate some of the things that our ancestors knew? How do we bring ourselves back into relationship with the cycles of nature, these sorts of things, as opposed to just linear? And at the same time, modernity is still chugging along. And without modernity, post-modernity couldn't exist. There wouldn't be free time to think about these things. There wouldn't be free crops to feed people who are thinking about these things. So post-modernity has brought all these perspectives to the table, but there's still a big vacuum of meaning. In some senses, there's actually a bigger vacuum of meaning because now we have so many of these perspectives. And while previous basically transformations in human culture have resulted in new political institutions, postmodernism has not really been able to actually coordinate us in a political way. Because it's a more complex perspective that is seeing more things, it's actually made it a bit more difficult to quote unquote get things done. And this is reaching a terminus now because we actually need to get things done if we're going to survive this century. And so this takes us to what is needed, which is we basically need a new story. We need a new perspective, which is a story is, I guess, a perspective drawn out into a narrative, but we need a new story that can integrate all these new perspectives that we have on the table. We need something that can recognize masculine and feminine, subjective and objective, um, past and future, right? Different cultures, different spiritual traditions. We need something that can recognize these and tolerate all of these while also unifying them into an actual wisdom culture that we can kind of hang our hat on and do something with. And it needs to basically take a stand. It's kind of that simple. This story needs to take a stand as to where we're trying to go, where we come from, where we're trying to go, and what the patterns of the universe are that we're trying to align ourselves with. It needs to have an answer to what the purpose and the meaning is that allows us to be constructive. What's actually really amazing news, which I actually don't think many people know, is that this has actually been done and it's been cracked. We live because of this world of, infinite perspectives. We don't actually, this doesn't actually really propagate because things are happening so siloed, apart from each other. Scientists are going off on their own side, philosophers are going off on their own side, artists, all these different disciplines are kind of chasing their own muse in a way. But something that a lot of people on the leading edge have noticed is that within a lot of these different disciplines, there has been a new story that is emerging from a variety of different disciplines. And two of them that I'll just highlight quickly are scientists and philosophers. So scientists, ever since the early 1900s, have been coming up with a new understanding of physics that's based on quantum physics as opposed to just Newtonian physics. And this has evolved over time in the last 100 years. There have been huge breakthroughs, and there have been breakthroughs specifically regarding the concept of complexity. So there's a whole new field of complexity science that has arisen. And this challenges what was the dominant view from the 1800s, which is that because of thermodynamics, because of entropy, everything is basically winding down. Like the universe that we have now is kind of like this cosmic accident that just came together through random chance, but the end state of the universe is basically equilibrium because of the second law of thermodynamics says in an isolated system, entropy will always increase. But breakthroughs in thermodynamics have actually had us understand that we are not in an isolated system. The universe is an open system, and there's energy coming in that we can't really account for because of the quantum realm, because of the quantum foam. The particles that we think exist and we thought were infinite, or I guess eternal in their in their reality can actually pop in and out of existence. There's new things coming into existence kind of out of the quantum foam, and things that we thought were there disappear. So there's a substrate to the universe where energy is actually coming into it. So we're not in an isolated system, we're in an open system, and energy is coming into the universe from outside of the universe, given this new understanding. And given that, what actually needs to happen is that the universe is organizing into more complexity so as to dissipate that energy that's coming in. Basically, the more complex a structure it is, the more energy it takes to run it. So it actually creates more entropy, but complex, which is what the universe is trying to do. That part of thermodynamics was right. But we need complexity basically to dissipate that new energy that's coming in. And so a better understanding of thermodynamics would be that the universe is actually creating complexity to be able to dissipate this new energy that's coming in from the quantum layer. This is a really big deal because this means that the universe is not winding down into smaller and smaller bits and eventually into a heat death of equilibrium. It's actually that the universe is winding up and is biased towards creating more complex structures like life, like mind, like societies, like cultures, these sorts of things. So this is a story that is not taught in high school. It's not taught really even in college because it's on the leading edge of scientific discovery. But this is a radically different view that has a lot of seeds in it that could help us start to piece together a new story. And the people who have pieced together a new story from it have been philosophers. And there have been a variety of philosophers over the last only 30, 40, or 50 years who have taken some of these new understandings and expounded on what does it actually mean to take this seriously? What does it actually mean to understand the evolutionary process as a process into higher complexity, that the universe is a organism that is basically evolving itself and is evolving into deeper stages. There were also breakthroughs in the fields of developmental psychology of human beings, and it looks like this process is also happening within human beings at a mental level. So it's not just happening in the universe as a force organizing matter and organizing biology. It's actually the way that mind and culture organizes as well. And so there are philosophers like Ken Wilber who have tried to put this into a new map of basically a theory of everything, where the evolutionary process is seen to go through the stages of physical matter to life to the development of mind, and the development of mind through the development of culture, leading us to the present moment. Um, that's pretty good as a unifying story for a species. It's pretty good to understand our place. It has science in it, it has space for spirituality. It's actually really robust. And if people can understand it, it is a transformative and life-changing perspective. But no one really knows, and no one really cares because it has so far been presented by philosophers, basically for other philosophers or for people who have been very, 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 very educated to the point where they understand the history of thought and they can understand how this argument is novel. People who can understand scientific literature so they don't get lost while they're reading the philosophy. It really requires literally the highest level of education any human being could ever or has ever been able to attain to understand this new picture in its raw form, because it's such a comprehensive picture that it's building on literally every other field of knowledge. So there has to be at least a basic competence in all these other fields to even grok this big picture and see why it's interesting. Um, Especially if it's taken to its kind of full level, which Wilbur does, which he integrates it with spirituality, which a lot of the other philosophers don't. And to do that, you actually have to have also done meditative training and contemplative training. And so to actually be able to even see what has been achieved, there's a incredibly, incredibly high bar. And this has basically made it so that this new story, which could really be the salve or the solution to the biggest problems we're facing on the planet today, it's basically unheard of and sometimes even dismissed as kind of just, why would we care about that? How is that relevant? These sorts of things. And
Mhm.
so that's kind of where I come in. I am here to change that. I'm here to make this story something that everyone knows.
Mm, mm,
So that's me. I am Ari. I go by my grandmother's the name my grandmother gave me, which is my middle name legally, but in this work I go by it as my first name, which is Atash. It means fire, like the transformative fire. I hope this worldview and this story will be for the planet. And the story is also one of transformation and change that and entropy and energy. And so I thought the concept of fire goes well with that. So that's me. And this is why I'm made for the task, basically. So this this role kind of came about on its own, which I think is the biggest reason why I feel so strongly about it. It didn't come from a desire for anything else. It emerged on its own as its own autotelic, for its own sake, desire in me over time. And a lot of my self-reflection through life has basically been trying to piece together why was I made in this kind of unique way? Why do I have this unique personality structure that doesn't seem to be good for a lot of things that current society needs? Why was I given this very strange upbringing by my parents and born into this very privileged and educated household? What are all these why was I born in Silicon Valley to understand kind of the technology um, that's transforming the world right now and the kind of the I guess the illness of the current culture. I was in some senses or in many cases born kind of at the edge. I was born at the edge of what the current society has been able to achieve, which has primed me well for leading us somewhere next. So these are just some, I guess, funny things uh, that make me I guess, well suited to be this bridge between kind of the esoteric scientists and philosophers to the broader culture. Um, and I'll just, I guess, go over these quickly so that it makes sense why I'm undertaking this as opposed to someone else. Um, I'm Persian, which is a interesting culture given that it's actually the bridge, it's a horizontal land bridge between India and China and the so-called West. Now we have even further west, but Persian culture for thousands of years was essentially a culture that was integrating insights coming in from Greece and from Turkey and from Egypt and from Europe even through to places like India and China. And it was taking not only wisdom and information, but also trade and spices and these sorts of things along the Silk Road. And so Persian culture is one that naturally is very integrative and is very hospitable to a variety of perspectives. And the whole kind of, I guess, medicine of Persian culture is about how to treat guests and how to um, yeah, basically be a good host and to have different people get along in an interaction. And that's very much what this sort of task requires is that outlook. I was raised traveling the world, so getting a very deep embodied sense of different cultures and different people, and deep in my soma, having respect and love for different types of people, different skin colors and smells, and religious orientations and biomes. It's deep in my body, kind of a love for Earth, and that allows me to stay open to the different perspectives that need to be integrated. Since I was a child, basically the shadow of our current culture, the major archetypical shadow of our current culture, which is kind of the dark feminine, the wild, untamed, mysterious aspect of ourselves and the world has been basically excommunicated from culture, excommunicated since the time of agriculture. So it's not even a new thing with modernity. It's actually been something that our species has rejected since we stopped living in nature and started having permanent settlements. This has been something we have over time successively distanced ourselves more and more and more from, but is needed now to actually allow us to metabolize the strangeness of the moment that we find ourselves in and the strangeness of the universe we find ourselves in more generally. And this archetype has presented itself to me basically from my earliest memories. And I have a deeply loving relationship with her. And I feel like she has entrusted me to bring her medicine and to bring her back into the story and into the culture. And I don't think any new story that doesn't deal with her in a really respectful and sacred way is going to actually be able to metabolize what has happened and what is happening and what is going to happen.
Mhm.
That's a unique thing. Um, I've had a another kind of similar relationship to the one that I've had with the Dark Mother with the sacred mushroom, in that it kind of sought me out on its own, I feel like. And in my first experience with it, told me it had something to tell me that it was going to reveal to me over time. And so this new story, the reason I went into the intellectual aspect of it is because I was already getting it in its kind of esoteric form, you could say, in an embodied sense from the work with the mushroom. And it seems like this planet itself is trying to birth forward this story. And my nervous system has been or is designed basically to be able to hold those states of altered and strange consciousness, to be able to receive some of the things the Earth Mother Gaia herself through the mushroom is actually trying to bring into her stewards, which is us humans. Um, I naturally am very shape shifty, and that is needed. It's kind of like the Persian thing, but basically the ability to meet people where they're at and make the story resonate with them, which is something that the scientists and the philosophers have been struggling with, is having it needed to be presented in that language and not being willing to convert it into language that can be accessible to others. Now, and I'm naturally quite capable of that. I've had parental support in this journey. So similar to philosophers of old or storytellers of old, like shamans of old who were supported by the tribe, I've been supported through some early wins I had in technology, but also I got a grant recently from my parents to continue to engage in this work. So I don't have a financial incentive, at least at the moment. I have a bit of runway, so this can really be for the benefit of all and not there's no ulterior motive in there financially to make this something that sells well or something like this. It's really for its own sake as a gift to the collective. And a big part of the story is that it needs to be integrative and include things together and be both and as opposed to either or. And that is kind of my natural disposition. I've represented that here by doing one eye with more feminine makeup, one eye without it. And I'm happy to sit in that duality. So these are things that have kind of presented themselves to me over my life. And they've been as much of a kind of a strange or interesting part of my understanding of myself. So this isn't a resume. It's more of, it seems like there's this thing happening in the world. Seems like there's this need for a group of people or someone to do something specifically here to kind of transition us from this one stage to the next stage. And I've kind of woken up in this body and mind and seen that I have a role to play there. So I've been on this journey for a few years now with this as kind of my main goal. First 2 years were kind of more healing oriented, just reorienting myself, defragging from the culture. But the last 2 years, I have been very actively pursuing this new story. So the question presents itself, what have I come up with so far? What I've made is called the Ancestor system. This has been the result of 2 years of work on this question, and it is basically a collection of maps, a collection of frameworks to understand reality and to simplify these kind of scientific and philosophical things into our actual embodied experience. It has three main inputs. The first is actually my experiences with the sacred mushroom, where a lot of this was revealed to me kind of in its primordial form, like not in English, in images, in experiences in my body and in my heart, in visions of the past and the future, the classic ceremonial explorative things that occur. But full body, full heart, full mind, full spirit downloads coming from 70 intentional ceremonies, or I guess 71 now, 71 intentional ceremonies with Slosby cubensis and the penis envy strain, which has been the one that has worked with me. I've taken those insights and have interpreted them through the lens of a variety of philosophical and kind of more academic and rigorous systems. The main one being Ken Wilber's integral theory and its related theories like spiral dynamics and ego development theory and Jungian psychology and basically academic level work trying to understand the evolutionary process of humans. Um, and I've also, brought a lot of my own lived experience as a, 24-year-old man in California and the experiences that I've had with working with my mother as I was her caretaker for a few years at home, and was helping her work through some of these things, and with a group of around a few, it fluctuates, but around 10 boys who are also my age through their process of becoming and healing and growing. And that's kind of the subtext of all of this is it's been specifically honed to be very digestible quickly by someone who's never going to read integral theory and never going to look into complexity science, someone who can just hear the system and start to get benefit out of it pretty quickly. So these are the four, I call them the four elements um, of the ancestor system. And in this presentation, I'm going to go over the levels and the lines, but I wanted to show all four of them at first, just to show kind of what the overall picture looks like. And these are graphic representations of the maps. I'll give a quick description of them before we go into a deeper dive into levels and lines. So levels refers to basically that process of complexity that I mentioned earlier. The levels are talking about the levels of evolution as it goes through the physical world, so from subatomic particles to atoms to molecules, through the stages of biological evolution that has resulted in human beings, which we're going to go over. So going through our ancestor species like cells and fish and reptiles and mammals and primates and early humans and modern humans and us today. And it also includes the developmental stages a fully modern human can go through. So it includes basically the transformations of ego development that an individual can go through in their life. And in the lineage, this is understood as kind of one, and from the science, this is understood as kind of one uh, layered process, one vertical kind of one vertical process from physical to biological to mental to cultural. These are actually all just more and more and more complex versions of the same phenomena. So the levels is a simplified understanding of that through the body, the human body, and eventually the human mind. The lines refer to the individual intelligences that come online throughout the evolutionary process. So very quickly, this would be something like physical intelligence and emotional intelligence. and there are others like, the intellect and a spiritual intelligence or communicative intelligence. So the idea is that the human being doesn't just have one kind of dominant intelligence system, like something like IQ. The idea is that we are actually comprised of these layers, these levels, and each level brought with it an intelligence, and that these intelligences exist within us right now, and they can be developed to different levels, or different I guess levels of skill, basically. So that's what the bar graph is representing, that we have these multiple intelligences and they can be at different levels of development.
Mhm.
And the ancestor system includes a map of 7 lines of development or 7 intelligences. The states um, refer to the fact that human beings can alter their relationship to what is arising in their field of awareness, which is something that has only emerged quite recently, but it's a big part of the human experience. And the states model um, is essentially, I guess you could say, a map of the states that we experience through all of life, but specifically it's granular around meditative states and the stages of kind of meditative awakening. It also includes a map of the spirit world, which I consider to be part of that same continuum. And they're kind of the cosmic states. They're the states that we can access within our own body, and then there's states we can tap into that are higher. And my states model, this part is very influenced, of course, by my contemplative work and from various contemplative traditions, but it also has a shamanic aspect that is left out of integral and is left out of a lot of other systems, which is it has a map of the spirit world as well and the places that you go to in psychedelic journeys. And that's kind of something that's unique about it as uh, compared to some other maps of meditative states. The final model is actually my most prized model, and it's the one that is most unique to the ancestor system. The other models are basically simplifications or kind of distillations of existing models within integral, but types is something that is not really mentioned at all in integral. Maybe there's around 30 pages on the types total in Ken Wilber's, multi-thousand page over. He basically just says there's masculine and feminine, and maybe you can use the Enneagram. But types is the area where I have a unique sensitivity to, and it's where I've put a lot of my novel, basically research and work is into the types. It's the system within the ancestor system, or it's the model within the ancestor system that's had the most iterations, and it is uh, the place where the Dark Mother comes into play. It's the place where we can see how some of these different energies that are fighting each other right now are become integrated, and that of course can happen in the others as well. But this is has been a big unlock for me and a big unlock for others. It is a uh, year based and seasonal based map of personality that is. Um,
Will you pause for 1 second? Stay where you are. I just want to take a note and not
yes.
um Okay, great.
Yeah. Um, in this presentation, I'm not going to go into these states and types. The reason for that is because they're kind of standalone from the levels and the lines. The levels and the lines emerged together in evolution. And in the way that I've currently created the system, the levels and lines are part of the same story. Whereas the states and types, I have not been able to integrate into one cohesive story yet. They're kind of standalone models. And so, for the sake of this presentation and the time limit, I'm going to go into levels and lines. But I wanted to briefly touch on the fact that there are robust models for states and types that the ancestor system contains. So, I'm going to give you a little breakdown of these two elements of the ancestor system, and they come in a 7-part story or story in 7 chapters. So, without any further ado, here we go. So, the human being is a layered being. What that means is that we did not emerge all at once just as a human being distinct from other animals like said in the Bible. In the Bible, we're made on a different day and we have no relationship to these other animals. Whereas we now understand that human beings actually emerged from a lineage of other animals and other beings, even all the way up from atoms themselves and subatomic particles. I haven't mentioned that here to simplify it, but initially, when the universe began, there were only subatomic particles. These came together to form atoms, and the atoms came together to form molecules. And eventually, the molecules come together to form organisms and the first life. And so that's the ancestor that I'm starting with in this presentation, which is the cell. So every single human being is, and every single animal, every single living thing on planet Earth has the same ancestor, which is the first living cell. This cell came about around 4 billion years ago, which is pretty crazy. It came only a few 100,000 years after, or I guess a few million years after the oceans consolidated on the planet. So the planet is about 5 billion years old. The oceans came via comets that bombarded the Earth. Comets have ice on them, and so many comets hit Earth and evaporated on contact with Earth, and then the water was caught in the gravitational field of Earth and became clouds, which rained down and created our oceans. Soon after these oceans were there, the oceans had the right contents of minerals, basically of molecules, that in certain locations, a new form of complexity could emerge, which was the first cells. These cells um, still live in us today. Every single bit of us is a cell. Our bones are cells, our brains are cells, our eyes are cells. Every bit of us is made out of cells. And these cells have at each stage of evolution, I'm making the case that there's a drive that comes online. You could call it a need, you could call it an optimization function. I often use the word drive because it does kind of have a kind of need like quality, or it's trying to be filled, it's trying to go somewhere. So we can also call it a need. But the drive that the first cells had was the drive towards health. You could also just say it's the drive towards survival, to live as opposed to die, to keep the ordering of this new level of complexity online. And they had an intelligence system, which is the kinesthetic intelligence system, which is the ability basically to touch. So cells have receptors and they know when they are hitting other cells. They know if they're touching a piece of nutrient or something like this. So our very earliest ancestor had the sense of touch. It couldn't see, it didn't have other senses, but it could say, am I touching something or am I not touching something? Where am I in space? And it was trying to survive. In human beings today, this is still preserved in our psychology and in our beingness. There is the first layer of our being, which various spiritual traditions have, or specifically the Hindu spiritual tradition, the tantric Hindu spiritual tradition has they call it a chakra or an energy center that has kind of this energy. And so I associate this layer of our being with the first chakra or the root chakra. And this is the desire to survive and the intelligence of touch. This is the first layer of our being, which comes from our ancestor, the cell. In our physical bodies, but like not in our subtle bodies where it's a chakra, in our physical body, it's actually our peripheral nervous system. So there's basically a branch-like, tree-like structure that's going down from our brain down into every organ, into our legs, into our fingers, that's connecting everything and is allowing these signals to transmit around. And that's how we touch things. That's how we know where we are and what's going on. So that structure exists in us still today, and those are literally just cells. The second level comes from our ancestor, the fish. So over time, these cells basically differentiated. So there became different types of cells. They went on different evolutionary trajectories and they started combining back together to create multicellular organisms made out of different types of cells. And eventually you get this very interesting multicellular organism called the fish or fish-like things. And this happened a long time later. So if you look at the first thing, it happened around 4 billion years ago. BYA just means billion years ago. Now fish emerged only 530 million years ago. So this is, basically 3 billion years later, it took for these cells to go on their process. And eventually you get fish. You get invertebrates in the interim period, but don't we didn't evolve from invertebrates. We evolved from vertebrates. Initially, we were invertebrates, and then we became vertebrates. But a lot of those structures, the are not really relevant to mention for human beings because they're so kind of primordial. The next one that's relevant to mention is the fish. And the fish have a crazy new thing, which is they have sense organs. So they don't just have, they're not, they're complex enough that they have groups of cells that are basically dedicated to a specific sort of sensing. So they have eyes, they have noses, they have mouths. And these different sense organs are coordinated through a central nervous system, which is the spine. And this is the first time that we got a spine. And the spine is just basically a bony protective structure around a central nervous cord. So all the peripheral nervous systems of the first layer are getting centralized into one kind of command center, which is what the fish gave us. And that command center, the spine, is trying to basically optimize the experience of these various organs. So it's trying to have the eyes look at the things that are most pleasing to it. It's trying to have the mouth tasting the things that are most pleasing to it. It's trying to have the nose smelling the things that are most pleasing to it, and to be averse to the things that sense organ does not like. So the scary images of other predators, the bad tastes of unhealthy water, the smell of something dangerous. It's trying to repulse or be averse to these things and go towards what is pleasurable. And this is what the spine does by being able to coordinate the activities of the body using the information coming in from the senses. And so the drive that is remaining in human beings from this stage and that fish themselves have is the drive towards pleasure. We could say it's the drive towards comfort, but you could think of it in a strong way as the drive towards pleasure. And it is overseen by the aesthetic intelligence, which is the intelligence that says, oh, I like how that looks, or I don't like how that looks, or I like how that tastes, or I don't really care how that tastes. And human beings still have this intelligence with us today, given that we do our hair and we do our makeup and we design our spaces. This intelligence of what is pleasing to the senses is very, very primordial and comes from our ancestor, the fish. So far we have two chakras. So we have two drives. We have survival or health and pleasure, and we have two intelligences, which are kinesthetic or physical and aesthetic or sensory. Is this making sense so far?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm giving it, I guess, in a kind of a just like a lecture style. Is that working, or would you like it to be more, I
No, it's
guess?
perfect.
Okay,
Perfect. Yeah.
very good. So something very strange happened only around 200 million years later. So we can see we're going from 530 million years, which is if for the kids in the back, it's the Cambrian explosion. Basically, this very crazy evolutionary event happened that resulted in fish, unprecedented. Um, about 310 million years ago, we have the reptile. So some of our fish ancestors started basically feeding on things closer and closer to the shore. Eventually, they started getting real spunky and get having bony appendages to help them run around the seashore. And eventually, you have animals that are living most of their lives on land. Eventually, you get reptiles. Reptiles are unique compared to our previous ancestors because they are evolved for land. So they're evolved for two-dimensional space as opposed to three-dimensional space. This is a big deal. When you're in three-dimensional space, the thing you want is basically um, there's always a direct line to it through water. So if there's some nutrients floating in front of me, I can just swim directly at it. Um, I don't have to make a decision of do I want to go left or right. I can just go directly at the thing that I want to go at. Whereas if I'm actually on two-dimensional land, I have to decide, do I go left? Do I go right? Do I go forward? Do I go back? There's a boulder here. How do I do this? And so the reptile has a whole new area of the brain that has to develop to start to be able to deal with this. And because of the two-dimensional environment as well, you can't just put your eggs just anywhere. You have to put them in a safe place. You have to actually have territory you're holding that you can be sure the right things are happening in that territory as opposed to just going wherever the water is. Because water, you can't hold territory in water. It's constantly moving. The nutrients are moving in it. On land, nutrients are stationary. So the fruit that you want is on a tree. The um, best position to fight from is a specific place that is not moving. So reptiles basically learned how to hold territory and defend territory from other reptiles. And they're trying to have the biggest territory possible so that these are the males. So the female reptiles, female lizards, let's say, that's kind of what we're talking about here. Female lizards come into the territory of the biggest, kind of strongest male and mate, and then they go off and lay their eggs. There's no live birth. The mothers don't take care of the eggs. They just lay them and keep going on their way. So reptiles have this new drive that comes on, which is the drive for esteem. And this is essentially a way to, I guess, anthropomorphize it because this is how it looks in us. In them, maybe it's a more primal version of kind of like courage or confidence or something like this. But basically, they're trying to hold the largest territory possible and the most favorable territory so that they basically win the mates. And the women are trying to see who the most dominant male is to get the best children, basically. And this requires the practical intelligence, which is how do I sequence tasks? How do I prioritize things? Because I'm on a two-dimensional surface and I have a limited basically locomotive capacity to get to the things I want to do. So you have to start sequencing stuff. This exists in us today. Both of these things exist in us today. Of course, the esteem drive is our desire to be respected, to fit in, to belong to some sort of a group, and um, to have basically favor within a specific group. And the practical intelligence is kind of our logistical intelligence. It's the intelligence that tells us how to achieve our goals, how to figure out the stuff that we're trying to do, what order we should do them, this sort of thing. And this comes online from a new brain area called the reptilian brain, which is right after the brainstem. It's right here at the back of our skulls. And it's an actual new organ that emerged that gave us these two new things. So far we have the um, the first chakra, which gives us the first chakra in the peripheral nervous system, which gives us the kinesthetic intelligence and the drive towards health. We have the central nervous system, the spine, which gives us the drive towards pleasure and the aesthetic intelligence of what is pleasing to the sense organs. And now we have the reptilian brain, which is giving us the drive towards esteem and belonging, and is giving us the practical intelligence of how to achieve that and achieve our goals. So a while later, some of these reptiles branched off and started to become a different sort of organism that the scales became hair, basically. And instead of laying eggs, we started experiencing live birth. So the female is actually giving birth to a live organism, a live child, and nurturing it for a while before sending it on its way. This is a huge change in the animal kingdom. This is kind of the first, hybrid or like multi-individual organism. The mother and child are basically one organism until separation, but they are in two distinct bodies. And this is not something that happens in the rest of nature. Sometimes you'll have the symbiosis between something like a wasp and a flower, but these are distinct species having a basically mutually beneficial interaction. This is different because it's actually the same species, the child of the previous one, fused with the elder one for a while. And so the same being, essentially, the same optimization threshold um, but in two bodies. And so what's needed is the communication between these two bodies of their needs and their internal states. And this results in the emotional intelligence. The emotional intelligence is the sensitivity to the emotional state of another. And this comes because we are mammals and we are born from mothers and have been with mothers for 200 million years. And so the mothers that survived, the mammals that survived, were the ones that were the most receptive and attentive to the emotional states of their children. And the children were the most, I guess, expressive in being able to communicate their emotional states to the mother. So this still lives on within us today. And this is the emotional intelligence. This is the ability to feel what another person is feeling. Sometimes it's called empathy. And the drive that is unlocked here is the drive for intimacy. Mammals are beings that are more complex and they're more sensitive. They're a bit less aggressive and mean as well than reptiles, um, and they desire intimacy. So the mother and child want to be close to one another because that is what creates the survival, right? The child is born from a mother and knows that if it's away from the mother, it's going to die because it's not self-sufficient in the same way a reptile or a fish would be after being born because it's a more complex organism. It has more organs to spin up. It has a more complex nervous system. So intimacy comes from the desire of the child to be with the mother, to be close to the object of love. Of course, in humans, its own thing and it can go beyond the mother. But we know also from Mr. Freud and from others that sometimes it never gets detached from that, and that it always has, to some degree, an undertone of that for both men and women. There is a need for a caregiver and a relationship to a caregiver. This is also exacerbated as a side note by modernity and the fact that we don't live in communal structures. So the whole intimate possibility comes through one person, which causes a lot of problems. This is um, this comes from the limbic system. So this is a new region of the brain. This is after the reptilian brain. And this is a region of the brain that allows us to interpret other people's emotions and have complex emotions because we are now in relationship. And to be in relationship requires these emotions. So this is the fourth layer of our being associated with the heart chakra and the limbic system coming from the mammals. These mammals, some of these mammals, um, stayed in the trees after the death of the dinosaurs. So the reptiles that we talked about emerging, our reptile ancestors, some of those reptiles evolved into these huge ass reptiles and basically conquered the earth, or maybe conquered is not the right word, dominated the ecological niches of the earth, meaning most ecological niches were being filled by an organism of the dinosaur template. So the big trees that have leaves that could be eaten, these are being eaten by brontosauruses, right? The fish that are in the water are being eaten by enormous reptiles. The other reptiles, are being eaten by even bigger reptiles. So for about 150 million years, dinosaurs ruled the ecological niches of the Earth until around 65 million years ago, a comet, or I guess an asteroid rather, came and hit Mexico, the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, and in a few short days, basically wiped out the majority of not only life on Earth, but made the dinosaurs go extinct. The only surviving dinosaurs today are in the form of birds, and they are a specific feathered lineage of dinosaurs that is related to the T-Rex. And they are still with us today, watching over us, watching us screw shit up, and laughing because they know what happened to their grandparents as well. And when that happened, the mammals took over the ecological niches. So if you think about a brontosaurus, right, this huge neck eating these tall branches in the trees, that's what a giraffe is, right? A giraffe is filling the same ecological niche, but it's a mammal. So it was born out of a mother and it can only get so big and it has emotions. So all of these niches, like the fish eating stuff started being done by whales and dolphins, which are horse-like guys that started going back into the water and eventually became adapted for the water. Seals, whales, these are mammals that went back into the water. We have our land animals like bears and cats and horses and deers and all these sorts of things, which were filling those ecological niches. And there is a lineage of mammal that mammals are from the trees. Mammals lived in trees during the time of the dinosaurs. And there's a lineage that stayed within the trees, and that is our lineage. These are the primates. So the primates are characterized by social troops of many individuals of both genders living together for the first time in the animal kingdom to have extended um, parental care for the entire duration of the lifetime by parents, and not only parents, but an entire community. So children, adults, elders of both genders is what comprises a troop of primates. In They evolved primarily in Africa, then they spread out to other places, but in the forests of Africa is where they kind of started out in the tropical region. And these primates, eventually, these kind of like monkey guys with tails, eventually there was a branch that created apes, which are smarter, bigger, tailless apes, or primates rather. And they usually live in groups of fewer individuals than groups of monkeys do. Like if you think about like baboons, you can see like, like 100 baboons or 50 baboons running around together. You won't usually see something more than like 30 or 40, basically, chimpanzees or gorillas or something like that be together because um, they have more going on in each of them. We come from this lineage, and because they lived in groups together, they essentially needed to be able to communicate to each other, not just mother and child, but across gender boundaries and across age boundaries of people that you may not actually be born from or related to very closely. And so this creates the expressive intelligence, which is the ability to use facial expression, tone of voice, body language, etc., to communicate specific information that is getting um, a bit more, you could say, mental in the sense that it's not just somatic, the communication of somatic states, like I'm hungry or I need milk or something like this, but also potentially warnings like there is a predator over there or we need to leave now. And these are things that we've seen modern day primates be able to communicate. They can communicate the location of threats. They can communicate basic commands to each other. And this is actually, more advanced than most people think apes and monkeys are capable of, but they have a pretty robust and complex language. It can't talk about things that don't exist in the physical world, but it can talk about things that are happening around. And this comes from the expressive intelligence, which evolved to coordinate groups of social animals. And the drive here, I've written mastery, and there's a million different ways you could say this, but it's essentially the desire to be useful in your unique function within a group. And I've called that mastery, but you could also call that authenticity or um, expression or playing your role, something like that. But because there's this group structure, and the desire here is to fulfill that role for the culture, for the group, um, to say what you want to say, to do what we need to do, basically. And this is the fifth layer. And the associated brain area is the cortex. So this is actually a layer after the limbic system, on top of the limbic system, that is regulating it, and allows us, to basically regulate emotions to some degree. And it has areas that are evolved for the use of the speech creation and the interpretation of the speech and facial expressions, expression of others. This is the cortex, and this is the fifth layer from our primate ancestor, from the throat chakra. Some of these primates, apes, started walking. It seems like this is because of a climate change in Africa around 2 million years ago, where the forest, or in the area that we were living, I guess, where the forest basically started to thin out. A lot of trees were dying, and we had an open savanna land as an environment. And to basically locomote slowly and efficiently over long distances, two legs are more efficient for this. Humans don't graze, so humans don't stand around and eat plants. So we need to go and find our food, like we need to gather and we need to hunt. So this is what's different about a human than, let's say, um, a sheep or a lion or something like this. They are sitting around a lot of the time, and they don't need to go everywhere to do what they need to do. Humans need to get around like this. And so our bodies evolved for bipedal locomotion, which is efficient over long distances. Basically constantly moving over long distances, it's better to be bipedal. So we became bipedal, and we were out of the trees. We were walking around in these tribal groups. And around 2 million years ago, it seems like something changed within us that allowed us to look at, let's say, a rock, and not just see a rock, but see that the rock could actually be used for something in a different context than what it's currently doing. So the rock right now is sitting on the ground. We see the rock, we say, oh, that rock could be used for hitting this bone and extracting the marrow. Better yet, maybe that rock isn't just a rock. Maybe there's actually a knife hiding inside of this rock. And if I hit off the parts of the rock that aren't the knife, I'll be left with the knife, and then I can use that to do other stuff. And this happened around 2 million years ago with our ancestor Homo habilis, which translates to the handyman. Habilis meaning hand, or tool maker. Homo meaning human, so human tool maker or handyman. And it seems like this ancestor of ours had some amount of symbolic intelligence or abstract intelligence, the ability to abstract away, okay, rock sitting here now, but actually it's not always stuck in its context. I can actually remove it from its context, abstract it out of its context, and see what other context it could be useful for. This is a profound change, and over time allowed us to create more complex tools, to harness fire, to start to get more energy out of our environment, which allowed for the brain to expand by the consumption of more meat in our diet, gave our bodies more energy, more nutrients to be able to develop a more and more complex brain. There was like I think I forget the exact number, so I won't butcher it, but there was a radical amount of brain size increase in our species over the last basically 2 million years. Since we figured this out, we basically remade our bodies by changing our diets. And you can see in something like this is a coyote skull, and you can see how, I'll just use the top portion of the brain case. You can see how this animal does not have a forehead. There is a brain back here, and then there are eyes, and then there's like a snout. But I have a huge forehead. My mouth has been pulled back down underneath my skull. So it's radically different than this. And that's because the we grew a whole new brain area that sits up here. So if a coyote were to have it, we would think it looks crazy, like it has some sort of tumor. And compared to other apes, we look like we have a tumor here because they don't have a forehead. They have a sloping brow ridge that goes back. They have a very pronounced brow ridge because there's nothing on top of it. The reason we don't have a brow ridge is because we have something there, which is a new area of the brain, which grew because of our new diets and our new habits. And that is the prefrontal cortex, which allows us to look at the cortex, look at the limbic system, look at the information coming from the body, and regulate it and wrangle it in a new way. That is our early human ancestor. This brings us to the final biological ancestor. We have not had any significant biological change for the last 50,000 years. If you could even say we haven't had significant biological change for 300,000 years, but there was a behavioral change around 50,000 years. So we're going to talk about what happened 50,000 years ago, which is it seems like our ancestors around 50,000 years ago in Africa became aware that they were going to die. Or another way of saying this is they became aware of their own awareness to some degree, and they wondered what happened to that awareness when they died. And this gave rise to the need to understand, why is this all happening? If at this point, when you actually become aware of awareness, okay, I'm going to die, what's the purpose of life? Of life? Why am I living if I'm eventually going to die? Before this, there's no understanding of this self-awareness. So the moment as it's arising is seen as kind of self-explanatory or enough, right? The ape is a part of this community, or even the early human is part of this tribe. It is seeing, you know, it has, oh, I guess I forgot to mention that when you have a symbolic mind, you start to seek how things work. You start to try and figure out how things work and gain knowledge around the mechanism of things, because you can now actually be confused as to the mechanism of things. And that's what the symbolic intelligence helps you understand, is starts to help you understand the mechanism of things. The seventh intelligence is trying to help us understand what things mean. So it's trying to help us understand, okay, why does the sun rise in the morning? Like, what is the significance of that? I know it rises, but like, why? Who is that? Where does it go when it's gone? Um, you know, how did we get here? Where are we going? These sorts of questions, the purpose and meaning of things. And this is the spiritual intelligence. And it helps us answer our drive, which is a drive to have meaning and purpose in the universe, to basically have our lives mean something or contribute to something larger than their, I guess, material or just like incarnate form. This desire for some sort of transcendent purpose. And this happened around 50,000 years ago, and we start to see this because humans start doing elaborate burials. So before people would die, they would some of our ancestors would bury them, but just kind of like put them in the ground. Whereas after 50,000 years, we see them being buried with items of value. So like with food, with precious materials, precious stones, with handmade objects, things that required a lot of energy to procure and to make. And why would you put this in the ground if not with someone who died, with if there isn't some sort of purpose for that, or there isn't some sort of reason, some larger spiritual understanding of that having some value. And this just doesn't emerge before 50,000 years ago. And around this time, we start to see art, the first real art. Humans start to be able to communicate and communicate things that are not real, quote unquote. They start to be able to talk about like gods or spirits or things that they cannot see with their own eyes. They start to be able to form larger groups because they can tell stories that unite larger amounts of people, etc., etc. This is what we are today. We are still one of these seven chakra, seven layered modern humans. And the system, this is a little fuzzier for me, but it's basically the synchronization of the two hemispheres of the brain that can happen consciously and often happens in quote unquote religious experience or spiritual experience or shamanic states. This is what drumming can do. This is what chanting can do and humming can do, is to get us in a state where the whole system is basically being cohered and aligned in an intentional way that is not being done by the environment. And this allows for basically us to experience things that meet this drive of purpose and help us connect with the spiritual. So that is the story of the levels and the lines. So this is what we went through, is the levels, which are the 7 layers here, and the levels come with their drive and they come with their intelligence. So these are the levels and the lines of the ancestor system. As a reminder, there are 2 more systems that I'm not mentioning here, but that are part of the system as well. Any questions before I move on into the what's next portion?
I'm good. It's been
Okay.
great.
What are we doing on time, or how are we doing on time?
I definitely have 15 more minutes, but I could probably push at 30.
Okay, that'd be great. I'll try and wrap this up in around 15 and then maybe 15 for questions.
Great.
So yes, these are 2 similarly robust. Actually, I would say the types is the most robust of all of them. It's incredibly extensive, but it would be its own presentation, and it's not worth diving into it a little bit if I'm not going to go the whole way. So I'll tease you with this medicine wheel here and know that it is
The
waiting
main
when needed.
course.
Yes. So what's next is, now that I mean, I have these maps, they're great. And, I have a group of people that use them. I have my mom uses them and tells them to people all the time. She uses them at work. So for example, the intelligences, the idea is that we all have 7 intelligences, but we have them in a different order. So some people are dominant in different intelligences. So for example, myself, it's usually said that I'm dominant in the spiritual intelligence first, the question of what things mean, as evidenced by this presentation. My second most dominant intelligence is my communicative intelligence, or my expressive intelligence, the ability to language things and to communicate using the other systems of the body, I guess, facial expression, tone of voice, etc. And the third intelligence that's very strong is the aesthetic intelligence. So I'm a 752, you could say. Um, I have friends, in every other permutation. And that's been a really helpful thing in relationships, because you can say, oh, okay, this person has a less powerful, or a less, I guess, dominant emotional intelligence. They're just not picking up on what I'm putting down. I have to communicate more, right? Or this person isn't resonating with what I'm saying because they don't have as high of a spiritual intelligence. How can I communicate this to them in a way kinesthetically that'll make sense to them? These sorts of things. So by understanding the intelligence systems that people are dominant in, we can learn how to relate to them better and more effectively. And there's a lot of understanding that happens when it's not like, oh, you're just weird, or you're just bad, or you just hate me. It's like, no, we're actually seeing the world through these different lenses. And once we both understand them, we can start to compensate for that. And I've seen that happen with my group of boys. There's been incredible um, levels of cohesion that we've been able to reach by like in planning for things, in coordinating, like going to Burning Man and things like that, and camping, because we know who to put on what, and we know when something's going wrong, how to have grace, because it's like, well, I'm well known for being poor at practical intelligence. I'm not great at prioritizing or sequencing. I'm kind of spacey in that way. And I'm also not very kinesthetically competent. So they don't have me drive our school bus, and they don't have me make the agenda for the week. There's someone else that's better at that, and they can have grace for me when I'm struggling with either of those things, vice versa. So, and yeah, have these systems, have these maps, they're in use, they're great, they're effective. Um, the thing is that they are kind of, as I mentioned earlier, they're standalone and they're kind of in an intellectual form. Like I can kind of tell them in this story, like I told you, and I think that's a huge advancement from some of the ways that, like, I mean, you should see the literature on multiple intelligences or the literature on evolution and complexity. It's, incomprehensible to most people. I think this represents, or at least I've found this helpful for me to understand it and to communicate it to others, but it's still pretty intellectually dominant. And it's like, it's still I6 dominant, right? And it's still like, here's a framework and a system. And what this actually needs to become, if I'm going to make good on that promise, I guess, or that need to have this reach more people and to become a living operating system for people, is it actually needs to be turned into something more of a living culture, into a system of rituals and mythology and ceremony, into a system of aesthetics, into a system of narratives. So we can think of it as going from the ancestor system. This is kind of what's coming next, right? Or what I'm working on next is taking it from being the ancestor system to being the ancestor mythos. And what I mean by mythos is that kind of full stack cultural thing that I just mentioned. Like when we look at ancient Egypt or you look at ancient Greece and you see how there are these ideas about how the world works, but it's being put into the built environment, it's being put into rituals, it's being put into plays and songs, new words are being created for it, it's being put into outfits, it's being put into um, everything. It's being put into life. It's being taken out of the intellectual realm and it's being brought down into the emotional experience and into the somatic experience. And
Mhm.
that's what needs to happen for this. And so this is the next step is the ancestor mythos as opposed to the ancestor system.
Mhm. Mhm.
The primary image, I think that is going to be used to do this, or the primary metaphor for this is going to be this metaphor of the world tree. And this has been the primary image that has been presented to me from the mushroom. And it's also the primary image of many or most indigenous wisdom traditions as well as pagan wisdom traditions. If you think about the world tree in Norse mythology with the serpent, the Midgard serpent, Jormungandr, circling around it. If you think about Hebrew mythology, you have the tree of life and the serpent around that tree. In the esoteric Jewish tradition, you have also the tree of life with a serpent coiling around it. Um, in in the Hindu system, you have the Kundalini going up the spine, right? Or through the chakras of the spine, which is a serpent kind of winding up this spine of the world. Um, you in Buddhism, of course, have similar things. So in many wisdom traditions, you have this image of there being kind of a vertical dimension to reality, which is represented by the tree, and then something that's cyclical, the cyclical change of the seasons, the cyclical evolutionary cycle or the reincarnation cycle. There's a cyclical aspect to the universe that's going round and around and around and around, and there's a vertical aspect to the universe that is becoming different, basically. And
Mhm.
when these two things are united, you have the spiral. Uh, and we have images like the caduceus uh, that represent this, right? You kind of have the spine of the world, and then you have the evolutionary process dancing up that spine into a union at the top. And this is come to me as well. Uh, so I'm going to knit the systems into the metaphor of the world tree and to tell the story of the world tree and to kind of start to use some of these mythological images. Um, Also, a quick note is that I believe any mythology that's going to be widely resonant and used by humans worldwide has to be earth-based in that we are human beings. Well, let me put it this way. Postmodernism has allowed us to recognize that all perspectives are potentially valid, right? That we can look at things in a infinite number of ways. You can tell the story in an infinite number of ways. I am not aiming to find the final answer to the universe. I think there are philosophers, there are mystics, there are other people that are trying to look for that, whether that's even possible, and that's amazing. I'm trying to create a wisdom culture on the planet that takes the stuff of that we figured out that's relevant for people to live their life, right? A lot of these things um, don't actually need to really be in play, and there's kind of a minimum viable metaphysics that's needed for adoption. You don't want to overload it with too many things. And so if we can pick any story, if we can tell any story to encode this wisdom to, I think we should tell a story that is deeply indigenous to the our actual experience, which is being human beings evolved in this specific lineage on planet Earth. And our lineage lived in trees. Our lineage for 200 million years has been around and related to trees. The reason our hands look like this, the hands that we do everything with, and that are the symbol of human culture, the reason our hands look like this is because a branch looks like this, and a opposable thumb allows you to grip onto a branch, right? So the primate hand is made for a branch. That's why we make things like that are sticks and poles and all that sort of stuff, car handles and whatnot, because we're meant to hold the branches of trees. So deeply within our physiology, in our soma, is the tree as a place of food, right? The fruits. Think about apps. Apps just look like fruits, right? They're gradients and they're shiny and they're bright. We love things like balloons because they look like fruits. Fruits are from trees, right? So we are primate people, we are mammal people, we are tree people. And so I think recognizing the tree or having the tree be a big part of our mythology also, brings us into deeper relationship with the earth. But recognizing that we are tree people and animal people will, I think, resonate with a lot of people just subconsciously. And then, creating mythologies that have, I guess, anthropomorphic qualities, I think allow people to relate to them better. So even if we are talking about things like complexity or entropy or whatever it is, being able to anthropomorphize them a little bit, even if we make them kind of animalistic or strange, but instead of just having them be rational forces, anthropomorphizing them is going to make more people be able to deal with them. So that's something I'm going to be playing with um, in the mythos. And I think the kind of the world tree, I can go into it more at a later date, but it contains within it, the vertical dimension, the cyclical dimension. It has the chakras, it has the dimensions, it has all of that going on. So that's coming soon. And some other detailed updates. I'm doing a full rehaul of my archetype system based on some conversations and interactions I've had with elders recently and with women, because I made this system in isolation with men and with myself. So that's getting a big update because of that. And I would love your help on that. The dimension system is getting a big update. That's a part of the state system, and it's kind of getting separated out from the states, which are, yeah, that's also getting an update. And then I'm adding in some new elements like this concept of the temples to talk about cultural evolution, which is kind of my own framing. I'm going to try and find a way to integrate Wilber's quadrants, which are pretty hard to explain to people, but I think are really needed. And so I'm going to try and find out some clever way to metabolize that into the system. And then I'm also going to add a new element, which is energy, because that is something that I've seen as a really big part of this is um, basically how much energy, how much prana we have access to allows us to um, metabolize things, or sometimes we can't do something not because we don't know what to do, but because we just don't have enough energy for it. And this seems to me to be a fundamental element of the universe. And I've been working with a older shaman, and this has become a big thing. So energy is something I'm going to integrate. So these are some of the detailed things after the world tree or alongside the world tree.
What did you say the dimension aspect of the revision is?
Yeah, the basically the
Oh, that's
dimension
when you were talking about the female perspective a bit coming in.
that's for the archetypes.
Okay, the archetypes.
That's for the archetypes. The dimensions are for dimensions are basically the layers of the spiritual realms, like where the ancestors live, the guides live, the weaver, the creator, all that kind of transcendental stuff that
Mm-hmm.
that needs a little bit of an update. I mean, basically the system so far, one way to think of it is that it's kind of ascending, like it's talking about how
Mm-hmm.
evolution is like winding up, but there is another aspect to it that we touch on when I talk about the states, which is the descending or the imminent thing or the and the
So
idea.
funny. I literally missed the dimensions part because I was making a note on that.
Yeah.
Great.
So that needs to be integrated. So the winding up and the, I guess, stepping down aspect of the universe needs to be integrated. And that's what the world tree allows us to do as well, is it you have
Mhm,
3 levels above, 3 levels below, and they meet in the heart. And
mhm,
there's all sorts
mhm,
of great stuff there.
mhm, 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 mhm,
So yeah, these are some updates. Very simply, what's next is I'm going to make the mythos. I'm going to share it with you and with other elders. I'm going to get feedback and start to refine it. And eventually, hopefully, start to put it into practice with people, start to actually do the ceremonies or um, whatever it is that we've come up with as the way to enact it, start to practice that and do that and share it with the world slowly but surely and invite people into that field of coherence, like you mentioned in Denver, slowly but surely, while also having, whether it be festivals or online meetups or whatever it is, for a much larger group that can participate in it for a short amount of time. I
mhm,
think festivals are a great way to do that and let people experience it momentarily before they commit to coming into the deeper layer of the mandala, which will require training and commitment of time and energy and these sorts of things. So
mhm,
having kind of different touch points where people can interact with it just online of, oh, this is a cool philosophy, I like it, I want to put it into practice, or I want to, it just makes me feel better about my life, okay, read a book or see videos online, okay. Then there's, actually show up to a festival or show up to a gathering of some sort where we're enacting some of this stuff. Maybe it's one of the celebrations for the archetypes that happen monthly, or for the big archetypes that happen on the equinoxes and solstices, those sorts of things. And then if you want to come in, you can actually become part of the cohort or the program and start to go through basically being trained to be tall enough to ride to actually enter the field of coherence. And then, once you're in the field of coherence, then the fun really begins. So kind of
mhm,
layered to the mandala. But this is a lifelong journey. So this is just a quick sketch.
mhm, mhm,
And yeah, this is a summary. So we're experiencing some problems on the planet. Those are resulting from a meaning crisis. We need a new story to solve that meaning crisis. It's already kind of been created, which is pretty amazing. No one knows about it or really cares. I'm here to hopefully change that and share it with more people. I've taken some of these scientific and philosophical insights and distilled them into a system of maps, essentially, which has a system of levels, a system of intelligences, a system of states, and a system of archetypes. But now it is time to take these and convert this system of maps into actual mythology and kind of like life culture. And then once I have that, or have some seed of that, we'll start to refine it and it'll be an evolutionary thing, but start to roll it out to the world in layers over time.
mhm, mhm.
So that's that.